In the last few years, electronic literature has moved beyond the print-based assumptions and characteristics of first-generation texts into second-generation works that increasingly exploit the capabilities offered by digital environments. In thinking about the relationship that digital literature and immersive fiction creates between the reader and text, there are aspects of the electronic reading experience that are lost as a result of this migration towards technologically enhanced literature, be it audiobooks, e-readers, or sensory fiction. With the advent of audiobooks, for example, the act of consuming literature has been moved to the periphery rather than an immersive experience. For example, while reading an audiobook, readers are able to multitask while engaging with the material, which brings into question the extent to which they are disengaged from the text. For instance, conversations after finishing an audiobook can often be focused around chores, housework, or other activities that are completed simultaneously. Can you recall a conversation you've had with someone about an audiobook they've just finished while being able to get so much done? It seems that even movies have been categorized into a new genre of background viewing, where an experience that is meant to be primarily sensory becomes secondary. This kind of multitasking is nearly impossible while reading a physical book, recognizing that audiobooks have proven to be both useful and powerful for establishing an engaging environment. For those who are visually impaired, we can also start to see the ways in which technologically enhanced literature is being used to consume literature more tangentially, and therefore create more distance between the audience and author. Ebooks are perhaps the most susceptible to this idea of what gets lost in the migration into technologized literature. There was a recent story published by a number of periodicals in response to the Microsoft announcement that they would be closing the ebook section of its online store, a closure which affected every ebook purchased from that store, which in turn led to one of the most beautifully dystopian phrases I've ever experienced. As Microsoft closes its ebook section, the books will stop working. Another way that we can see the distance between the reader and text manifest itself is how digital publishing interacts with libraries. The Canadian Federation of Library Associations, or the CFLA, announced that Penguin and Random House currently charges libraries anywhere between $35 and $50 for every copy of an ebook for a 2-year period, after which the book expires. The industry has termed this rental agreement controlled digital lending, a process that never really applied to physical books. My video essay will be examining the trajectory of electronic literature. As literature moves further and further into the digital realm, I believe that the reader is further distanced from the text. I'll begin by briefly examining the advent of the audiobook, e-readers, and finally the evolution towards sensory fiction, an emerging modality of literature that invites the reader to experience a text through haptic perception. The title of my paper borrows from John Austin's essay, How to Do Things with Words, where he argues that instead of focusing on semantics and what words mean, we should focus on what people mean. In other words, we should focus on the various things that people do, or to use his language, the acts they perform when they speak. He says, words don't just say things, they do things. However, a central question that will be presented throughout my paper will focus on the extent to which words can lose their impact when translated or transposed into a digital format that prioritizes haptic perception. The primary text I'll be examining is James Tiptree's The Girl Who Is Plugged In, whose 1973 novella has been readapted into this technologically enhanced haptic experience. This new edition is being released with wearable mechanisms that combine networked sensors and actuators to create an immersive storytelling experience tailored to the reader. This new and improved technologically enhanced novella portrays the scenery and sets the mood, as the book cover animates to reflect the book's changing atmosphere, while certain passages trigger vibration patterns. The wearable vest, yes, the book comes with a vest, allows the reader to experience the protagonist's physiological emotions. I will also explore not only how sensorial immersive fiction creates a passive reading experience, but how it can also remove the reader from that reading experience. Sensory fiction tends to take focus away from the text and place more emphasis on the technology it employs to create an immersive environment rather than allowing that immersive environment to emerge naturally through the reader's perceptions, as opposed to haptic. In order to talk about the separation, I will be looking at Walter Ong's eponymous argument taken from his article, Writing is a Technology That Restructures Thought, where he talks about the relation of computers and writing, and how computers create a larger physical separation between the reader and the author, or between the reader and the knowledge the text is attempting to convey. This does not allow room for discourse, as a computer is something which is programmed. Haptic perception has become one of the ways in which immersive storytelling respatializes literature and converts text from a descriptive into a prescriptive one. The reading experience, therefore, becomes more polarized, as focus is placed on the body to internalize emotions, environments, and experiences of the characters. By connecting the reader's physiology to the text, reading becomes a unidimensional rather than a multidimensional activity, whereby the audience is actively led to interpret the text in a distinct manner. In the same way that visual technology is progressing further into the realm of augmented reality, literature is experiencing a similar technologized trajectory. In this presentation, I will be using the term technologized literature to refer to digital text, audiobooks, and haptic literature. This idea of technologized literature can be traced back to 1930, where the concept of a machine that stores books was first introduced by Bob Brown. In his manifesto, The Readies, Brown introduces the idea of a reading machine we can carry around or move around, attached to any old electric light plug, and read 100,000-word novels in 10 minutes if I want to, and I want to. But Project Gutenberg became the first platform to digitize texts in the early 1970s, where Michael Hart created the world's first ebook library. The emergence of what can be considered the first audiobook can be traced back to the late 19th century, where gramophones had the capacity to capture poems that only played for a few minutes at a time. However, full-length novels weren't recorded until the 1930s. Rubry notes that the first talking books were delivered through mail to readers in America in October of 1934. They included the Bible, patriotic documents like the Declaration of Independence, and fictional works such as Shakespeare, Rudyard Kipling, and Agatha Christie. These books were initially recorded for people with visual disabilities across America and Britain. As technology continued to become more prevalent in the literary world, new ways of reading and seeing literature also emerged. One of the newer forms of technologized literature to emerge from this evolution was wearable literature, or sensory fiction, which creates an immersive reading experience through the use of multinodal and multisensory systems attached to the reader, creating a physiological connection to the text itself. In thinking about the connection between reader and text, scholars have generally addressed the ways in which digital or technologized literature creates an immersive reading experience. And although research offers important insights into the ways in which immersive literature is changing the reading experience by examining the benefits and drawbacks of technologically enhanced immersive texts, there's still the question of how the technologization of literature creates more of a passive or hypo-immersive mode of conception. Technology does and can afford a different kind of immersion within the enhanced environment that is built for the user, such as the kind of virtual reality experienced in the gaming culture. This type of immersion creates a sense of being absorbed in a virtual world, which is in turn created and sustained by the technological mechanisms involved in its display, rather than by our mental acts of imagination. In contrast, the kind of immersion that is created by a captivating novel without the disruption of haptic sensors is largely produced and facilitated by our own cognitive abilities to create that fictive world via symbolic representations within the text itself. In this context, the features of the book itself function on their own merit and work to facilitate and not disturb immersion. In an attempt to create a unique, colorful, and immersive reading experience, sensory fiction instead creates a homogenized one, wherein every consumer of the text is invited to experience the same emotions. Much in the way that audiobooks have the potential of influencing or guiding their readers into certain assumptions as that text is read by someone else, sensory fiction would have a similar effect on a larger scale, as the multimodal sensors might function as a laugh track, prompting the reader to feel certain emotions at specified points in the text. The multimodal sensors that guide meaning and assumptions can be thought of as the haptic narrator operating in a liminal space between the true narrator of the novel and the reader. In other words, the haptic narrator interprets the text and passes these impressions, or rather vibrations, onto the reader, thus excluding the reader from the invitation to form their own impressions. Could this haptic narrator then be thought of as an unreliable one? Experiencing text digitally, moreover, either through mouse clicks, touchscreens, or an ebook page turner bar is very different from that of the experience of flipping through the print pages of a book. The feeling of the printed text is lost when the actions, like clicking with the mouse, pointing on touchscreens, or scrolling with keys or on touchpads, take place at a distance from the digital text, which is somehow, somewhere, inside the computer, ebook, or mobile phone. The intangibility of the text affects the reading experience, as reading of the digital text will differ profoundly from that of a printed text. Given that the print text is tangible, it is physically perceptible in ways that digital texts are not. Such a difference is structurally distinct, meaning that it will have significant consequences for our reading of the different texts. Mangan notes that as readers in the phenomenological world, we grasp the invisible as real and present it in its own way. In other words, when reading traditional print literature without the aid of haptic sensors, invites the reader to construct their own setting, meaning, and scenery from the text presented. Moreover, the invisible is real and present in a way that significantly impacts our experience of the text being perceived. According to some scholars, the invisible is what grounds vision and gives the visible within it a substantial thickness and dimension. This depth, thickness, and dimension becomes absent in texts that are transposed to the screen due to its intangibility. Despite its multimodal sensory attachments, the reissued The Girl Who Was Plugged In lacks material substance and therefore has no visible dimensions. The moment of conversion from the tactile to the digital is a moment where all traces of tangibility become removed. The way in which a printed text is constructed affords different sensory experiences, ones which the reader is invited to engage with through imagination. In his discussion comparing writing to technology, Walter Ong talks about the physical separation that computers create, as they do not allow room for discourse because computers are programmed, much like our emotions become programmed when we receive haptic vibrations that allow us to feel what characters feel. As previous research has shown, one main effect of the intangibility of the digital text is that it has the capacity to inform shallower, less focused readings. We tend to scan on screen. We listen to audiobooks in the background, and we are invited to be a passive audience through the act of being plugged in. Sensory fiction is highly vulnerable to distractions, particularly when these distractions are presented in the form of vibrations or senses that the readers might not feel or expect to feel at the point in the text that those shocks are administered. Psychologists argue that we are psychobiologically inclined to resort to such means of rekindling our attention when our attention is, so to speak, exhausted. That is, when there is nothing left in view to maintain our interest. The question of how materiality versus digital consumption affects the reader cognitively is still a contested one in the literature. But a study conducted by Morneau finds that electronic literature does not provide the external indicators to memory in the way that a print book does. In digital formats, the connection between the text, content, and material support is split up, allowing the technological device to display a multitude of content that can be altered with a click. The printed book, by contrast, is a physically and functionally unitary object, where the content cannot be distinguished from the material part. So they conclude that the electronic literature does not serve as an unambiguous index to indicate a field of knowledge on the basis of its particular physical form. Hardwired haptic dispositions also help explain why sensory fiction as a reading modality seems to be poorly suited for the immersive and deeply focused reading associated with the printed book. When reading a book, the text in the book as a static and fixed perceptual phenomenon simply does not provide us with the options for attentional switching and for technologically stimulating our attention responses. When reading a traditional print-based book, the text in that book as a static and fixed perceptual phenomenon simply doesn't provide us with the options for attentional switching and for technologically stimulating our attentional responses. What we resort to when getting bored by reading a book is usually abandoning the activity altogether, precisely because the activity, reading the fixed text, and the technologies involved do not themselves provide any alternative stimulation. This is where reading an audiobook becomes so appealing. It's an activity that can be done without engaging with the material. Haptic literature can be seen as new and emerging affective computing systems, wireless, wearable, and spatially organized experiences that provide a conduit between the computer as a tool and the text as a feeling machine. Sensory fiction, like augmented reality, builds an environment for the audience, removing or substantially limiting the room for their own interpretation of the text. One of the most interesting questions that emerges from discussions surrounding technologized fiction is whether it has the potential to not only change the landscape of how literature is read, but how it is written. While most instances of communication via networked computers only slightly affect the roles of reader and writer, theorists have argued that the ease and speed of communication can, in principle, substantially reshape the relationship between producers and consumers of information. As electronic literature progresses further, it also develops its own writing composition style, rhetoric, grammar, and syntax that becomes specific to digital environments. Technologized literature calls forth from us new modes of attending, listening, seeing, moving, navigating that transform what it means to experience literature. Reads is no longer an adequate term. It is possible that technologized literature invites us to attend to literature and fiction in novel and beneficial ways, serving as an aid to those who require it. However, it also seems plausible that the particular immersion that emerges naturally when engaging with a text is related to and often dependent on the tangibility of the printed pages of the book itself. No matter how print-like the quality of ebook screen or how strong the sensory vibrations of the attaché nodes, texts in the digital era are becoming more detached from the reader in terms of creating an immersive, active experience.